wish someone knew about the Roman military around here.
We'll tell you about the Roman military. Rock on.
The Roman military was arguably the most effective and largest army in the ancient world. With a campaign history longer than 1,300 years, Rome was clearly one of the strongest and most well-organized armies of that ancient world. The two main purposes of this military were to war enemy nations and to maintain their own nation that stretched all the way east to Iran, north to England, and south to the northern part of Africa. In fact, the main reason that Rome existed at all was to suffice for its own military needs. Because without that military, they would not have been able to grow into the vast and legendary empire that they're known as today. At its territorial height, Rome had a standing army of about 300 to 400,000 legion that was spread across Rome during non-war times. This legion that was spread across the nation was used for many purposes such as border patrol, engineering, and even medical staff. This military also served as the main police force across Rome. There were two basic types of legionary soldiers: the regular legion, which were just Roman citizens, and then the auxila, which were non-Roman citizens fighting in the army to earn their citizenship until they were honorably discharged as Roman citizens. With the military this large, a sophisticated organizational system was clearly needed, and Rome was no exception to that. Out of this need came the Roman hierarchy, which was a system of many different ranks of officers and soldiers in a direct chain of command. Along with dividing the command, the Roman army also divided these groups of soldiers into much smaller divisions to ease the management process. The largest of these divisions was called a legion. A legion consisted of 4,800 to 5,400 men. One legion then divided into 10 cohorts, which each contained about 480 men. One cohort then divided into 6 century, and in 1 century were 60 to 80 men. Within this organizational system, there was many ranks of officers. There were officers to manage the entire legion, a single cohort, and even a single century. The highest ranking of all officers was the imperial legate, who managed 2 or more legions at a time. This position was appointed by the emperor and lasted for about 3 to 4 years on average. The next officer in this chain of command was the legion legate, who was the single commander of 1 legion. One of these legates would also serve as the imperial legate should anything happen to him. This position was also appointed by the emperor and also lasted 3 to 4 years. This legate was also the main commander of all of the auxila within that legion. The next in command of a single legion was the broad-band tribune. The reason they are called this was due to the broad striped tunic that they wore at this rank. The only real purpose that this officer served was second in command to that legion, and only took command if anything happened to the legion legate. Third in command of the legion was the camp prefect, who was also in charge of training those men. The camp prefect was also the last in command of the senior officers. The next group of soldiers that were in command behind the senior officers were called the centurions. These centurions were the ones who were in charge of the single cohorts and even the single centuries within those cohorts. The most senior and in command of these centurion was the primus pilus. This centurion was in charge of the first cohort within each legion. They also directly commanded the first sentry within each cohort. The next centurion in this chain of command was the Pilus Prior, or the front file. There were many front files, or Pilus Priors, for each legion. In fact, the 10 first cohorts all had their own Pilus Prior. There was also 5 other centuries per cohort. These 5 men would also each manage their own century, and if anything ever happened to the Pilus Prior, one of these would be chosen to take his position. There were also senior officers below the centurion rank. The first ranking of these senior officers was the Optio, who was second to the centurion and comparable to the modern lieutenant. Behind him was the Tessarius, which was second behind the Optio, and he was comparable to the first or staff sergeant in the modern military. In the Roman military, brotherhood was extremely important. They also focused highly on honor and loyalty. They even had special positions just to portray and maintain that culture during battle. The most important by far of these special positions was the Aquilifer, or the eagle bearer. What he carried was a long staff with an eagle statue on the top of it that represents Rome as a whole. If he was lost during a battle, that was considered the greatest dishonor that a Roman legion could endure. These soldiers that had special skills and had specific skills that could help them were called immunes, and they were paid at least twice the minimum wage of a Roman soldier. But this sophisticated chain of command was not the only important thing in the Roman military. In fact, battle strategy and armoring was possibly the most important.
The Roman military often put new recruits in the front lines in front of the veterans. That way, when they were fighting, they'd have the courage because of the veterans behind them, and for the ones who got scared, could not run away. Legionaries would often run at their enemy and throw their spears at them, and through the confusion, move in for close quarters combat using their swords and their shields. The Romans were equipped with a sword called the gladius, a spear called a pilum, and a shield called the scutum. They also had a breastplate and one greave on the left leg, the leg that was leaning towards the side of battle. The body armor of the heavy infantry, frontline soldiers, and veterans consisted of a 20-centimeter square breastplate and one greave on their leg. The more lightly armed soldiers wore no armor at all, but a plain helmet which was sometimes decorated so centurions could see them from a distance and judge their efforts in battle. The cavalry of the Romans were often equipped in Greek fashion with cuirass, which is a torso plate, and a round shield. Also, they wore a mail shirt. The Romans used many formations during battle. One of these was the tortoise formation, where legionaries would hold up their shields except for the men in the front. That way, they could not be hit by arrows overhead, and they had protection from oncoming men in front of them. The men in front were responsible for protecting the men who had their shields held high. This kind of enlisted the brotherhood that the men had with each other and trust that they showed.
The front and arrows.
On command, the men in the front would begin the movement, and the whole unit would move in unison. This gave protection from spears and swords in the front, as well as arrows on the top. Another common formation used by the Romans was the wedge formation. This formation consisted of one man in the very front and forming backwards like a pyramid, so 1, 2, 3, and so on. This formation gave them the opportunity to penetrate enemy lines, and once they were in these enemy lines, spread out and cause havoc throughout it. In conclusion, the combination of formations, military organization and strategies, led way to the Romans becoming one of the most powerful ancient militaries of all time, with their reign lasting about 1,300 years. This shows that they are a massive army, great leadership, and great determination.